In August 2022, two workers in the remote wilderness of Alaska stumbled upon an eerie discovery that would unravel a mystery 9 years in the making. High above the forest floor, wedged between towering spruce trees, was an old, weather-beaten cabin. It was no ordinary structure, though it was suspended 12 feet in the air with no ladder in sight. As they climbed up to investigate, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a chilling sight inside. A human skeleton, slumped against the wall, dressed in the decaying remnants of hiking clothes. What made this discovery even more unsettling was the condition of the cabin. The door, which had been sealed shut for years, was boarded up from the inside. No one could have left, and no one could have entered unless, of course, they had been trapped there. Who was this person, and how had they ended up in such a tragic and bizarre fate? This grim scene in the Alaskan woods would eventually lead to the chilling story of Patrick O'Hara, a seasoned traveler who disappeared without a trace almost a decade earlier. His journey into the heart of Alaska's Tongass National Forest was meant to be just another adventure, but it would end in a way no one could have ever predicted. Patrick O'Hara was no stranger to adventure. Born and raised in Vancouver, he had always been a keen explorer, drawn to the wild beauty of the outdoors. A seasoned IT specialist, Patrick's career was grounded in logic and precision, but his heart belonged to the open wilderness. By 2013, he had already explored various hiking trails in British Columbia, mastering the art of navigation and survival in the most remote corners of nature. This was a man who knew how to stay calm under pressure, a trait that had been honed through years of solo trekking. Yet, it would be this very expertise that would make his disappearance in the Alaskan wilderness all the more baffling. When Patrick set off for his solo trip in July 2013, his journey wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Far from it. He had spent months preparing, meticulously planning his route through the Tongass National Forest, one of the most untouched and perilous parts of Alaska. The forest spans a staggering 17 million acres, a dense network of coniferous trees that blocks out the sun, shrouding the land in constant shadow. The region's unpredictable weather, with its endless rain and heavy fog, combined with a difficult terrain, made it a destination for only the most experienced hikers. But Patrick, who had spent years mastering such conditions, felt confident and well prepared for the challenge ahead. His preparation was methodical. Patrick packed only the essentials, but ensured that each item had a specific purpose. He wasn't one for unnecessary luxuries when out in the wild. His backpack was filled with freeze-dried meals, enough to last him for 10 days, waterproof matches, a gas canister for his stove, and a brand-new compass, even though he already had a GPS device. Every detail was carefully thought out. Patrick even purchased a particular brand of gas canisters at a local store, demonstrating his familiarity with the gear he needed. He wasn't just prepared, he was equipped with the tools to survive in the harshest of conditions. He was calm, collected, and in excellent physical shape, a man with a plan. The morning he left the town of Ketchikan, his final sighting was at a local tourist shop. The elderly shopkeeper, Gary, recalled their conversation in the days that followed. Patrick appeared to be in his element, not at all like the typical tourist who might underestimate the wilds of Alaska. Instead, he spoke of his route, one that veered far from the popular hiking trails. His mission was clear: to witness nature in its most raw, untamed form. He was not searching for civilization, nor was he seeking comfort. This was a man who thrived on solitude and the purity of the wild. Gary remembered how Patrick paid in cash, threw his backpack over his shoulder, and left the store with quiet determination. The last words he said before disappearing into the woods were to his sister. A brief but reassuring message sent on July 12th, just before he embarked on the trail. Heading out on the trail, everything is according to plan. Next contact in 8 days. It was a message full of confidence, a message that seemed to confirm Patrick's preparedness for what lay ahead. 8 days was the window he had given himself, a manageable timeline for a man who had trekked through remote and challenging terrains before. But as the days passed and the deadline came and went, Patrick's family remained unfazed. They had grown used to his isolated trips, knowing that in the wilderness, communication could be sparse or even impossible. However, when the 8 days passed without a word from Patrick, his sister began to feel uneasy. A few extra days passed, as Patrick had allowed himself a 2-day buffer, but still there was no contact. By July 23rd, the family's worry turned to action. Patrick's sister called the Alaska State Police to report her brother missing. The search for Patrick O'Hara had officially begun. What followed was a frantic effort to find him. A team of local volunteers, many of them experienced with the Tongass Forest's challenging terrain, joined the search, but time was not on their side. With each passing hour, the chances of finding Patrick alive grew slimmer. The dense forest, coupled with thick fog and the constant rain, made it almost impossible to locate anyone, especially someone as well prepared as Patrick. The searchers, armed with helicopters and on-the-ground teams, scoured the area, but with limited success. The thick treetops blocked the view from above, and the forest floor was so overgrown that they could barely cover a few miles a day. Despite their best efforts, the search was fruitless. There were no signs of Patrick, no footprints, no scraps of catter, clothing, and no traces of a struggle. His disappearance remained an unsettling mystery. Had he fallen and injured himself? Was he lost? Or, as the weeks went by, did it seem increasingly unlikely that he had survived the harsh conditions? Eventually, the active search was called off, and Patrick was officially declared missing. His case would remain cold for years to come, the mystery of his disappearance becoming one more haunting enigma in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Tongass National Forest. For 9 years, Patrick O'Hara's family, friends, and the authorities were left with nothing but unanswered questions. The forest, with all its secrets, had swallowed him whole, and for nearly a decade, no one knew why. The search for Patrick O'Hara was a race against time, but from the very beginning, the odds were stacked against the rescue teams. As soon as his sister reported him missing on July 23rd, a full-scale search was launched. Local volunteers, many of whom had lived in Ketchikan for years, knew the terrain of the Tongass National Forest well. Yet even their expertise seemed insufficient in the face of nature's unforgiving wilderness. The forest was dense, its towering trees and thick underbrush making movement difficult. The constant rain, fog, and unpredictable weather made it even harder for rescuers to get a clear sense of direction. Helicopters were deployed to search from the air, but the thick canopy of trees obstructed any view from above, leaving the teams with little more than a vague sense of where they might find him. On the ground, the situation was no less grim. The forest floor was boggy, slippery, and littered with fallen trees. Despite the best efforts of search teams, they could barely cover a few miles a day, and the days turned into weeks with no sign of Patrick. The conditions were hostile, the hours long, and the sense of isolation overwhelming. Despite the exhaustion, the volunteers pressed on. They knew the stakes were high. Without food, a man could last only a few days in such conditions, and Patrick had been missing for far too long. Then, on the 7th day of the search, a breakthrough came. A search team, trudging through the damp undergrowth, stumbled upon something unexpected. Half a mile from the main trail, in a small clearing by a stream, they discovered Patrick's tent. At first glance, it seemed like a hopeful sign, but as the team approached, their optimism quickly faded. The camp, though intact, was strangely untouched. Everything was neatly packed away, as if Patrick had left the camp at first light, leaving no sign of a struggle or urgency. His sleeping bag was folded and stowed, his clothes neatly rolled, and his food neatly stored away. Even his cooking gear had been carefully packed into a compression bag. There was no trace of panic, no evidence of a hasty departure. No torn-up equipment, no scattered food that could have attracted animals, no broken branches, no evidence that something had gone terribly wrong. It seemed as though Patrick had gotten up from his camp, folded his things, and simply walked away, leaving no trace of where he had gone next. The sight of the abandoned camp raised more questions than it answered. How could an experienced hiker, who was so meticulous about his preparations, have disappeared without a trace? If he had been injured or disoriented, why hadn't he left a sign of distress? And why had he left his tent, sleeping bag, and supplies behind, things that any hiker would need for survival? The forensic experts who arrived at the scene were just as baffled. They were used to finding signs of panic or desperation in cases like this, but everything in the camp seemed too calm. It was as though Patrick had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the perfect semblance of an orderly departure. As the search continued, the forest seemed to swallow every clue. Hours turned into days, and still there were no signs of Patrick. No footprints in the mud, no discarded clothing, nothing to indicate which direction he had gone. All that remained was his meticulously packed camp and the haunting feeling that the forest was hiding something from them. The search was called off after a few weeks, and Patrick O'Hara was officially declared missing. The authorities, the search teams, and his family were left with more questions than answers. Where had Patrick gone? Had he simply wandered off and gotten lost, or had something far more sinister happened? The lack of evidence made it impossible to determine what had really happened to him. His disappearance became one of many mysteries that the Tongass National Forest seemed to keep hidden within its dense, mist-covered expanse. As the weeks turned into months, the hope of finding Patrick alive began to fade. His family struggled to cope with the uncertainty, not knowing if they would ever get closure. The authorities put the case on hold, listing it as unsolved, but for those who knew him, the questions lingered. The case of Patrick O'Hara became another unsolved mystery, filed away in the archives, never to be answered. For 9 years the forest kept its secrets, and those closest to Patrick were left to wonder what really happened to him on that fateful hike. 9 years passed since Patrick O'Hara vanished without a trace in the vast wilderness of Alaska's Tongass National Forest. His disappearance remained one of the many unanswered mysteries of the region, filed away as an unsolved case in the archives, as time seemed to erase any hope of finding him. But, in August 2022, the silence was broken in the most unexpected way. Two foremen, Mark Collins and Dave Miller, were carrying out routine work for the U.S. Forest Service, assessing the condition of trees in a remote part of the forest that hadn't been inspected for decades. Their task was mundane, yet what they would find that evening would be anything but ordinary. While navigating through the dense, towering trees of the Tongass forest, Mark paused to check the map, only to notice something peculiar up ahead. Among the thick spruce trees, something unnatural caught his eye, a dark, rectangular shape suspended high above the ground. It was out of place, an unmistakable sign that it wasn't just another fallen tree or a natural formation. Intrigued, Mark called Dave over, and together they made their way toward it. As they drew closer, they saw it. A cabin, or at least what appeared to be one, wedged between 4 massive tree trunks, approximately 12 feet in the air. The structure was crude, made from rough-hewn, weather-beaten planks, moss clinging to its sides, blending in with the natural environment in a way that suggested it had been there for decades. But the most bizarre feature was the absence of a ladder or any means of access. There was no rope, no wooden steps, nothing that would allow someone to reach the cabin, leaving it suspended in the air like a forgotten relic from another time. How was anyone supposed to get inside? Mark, a seasoned tree climber, recognized that something was off, but his curiosity led him to attempt to scale one of the trees. With his climbing gear secured, he began his ascent. Once Mark reached the level of the cabin, he found himself face to face with an old door. At first he pushed against it, expecting it to open, but it was firmly shut. His flashlight flickered in the growing twilight as he examined the cabin more closely. There were no windows, just narrow slits between the planks that allowed small glimpses of the interior. Mark tried again, pushing harder against the door. This time, with a creak, one of the planks of the door frame gave way. The door opened, revealing a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, a pungent mix of dampness and rot. As Mark's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw what had been hidden in the shadows for so long, the skeletal remains of a human body slumped against the far wall of the cabin. The bones were yellowed and brittle, some still loosely connected by dried ligaments and tatters of clothing. The skull, unnaturally tilted towards the chest, lay a few feet from the rest of the skeleton, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there. The body had clearly been there for years. The only question was who it had once belonged to. The discovery sent a chill down Mark's spine, and it wasn't long before he realized the grim significance of what he had found. This was no ordinary abandoned structure. The eerie, almost haunted nature of the cabin, combined with the body inside, raised more questions than answers. How had this person ended up here? How had they been trapped inside? The mystery of the tree cabin seemed to deepen with every new detail. Mark continued to survey the inside, his flashlight illuminating the surroundings. Beside the remains, he noticed a few personal items scattered around the floor. A small metal pot lay nearby, its contents dried up and unidentifiable, while a weathered backpack rested against one of the walls. The bag looked like it had been left untouched for years. Yet there was no sign of wildlife or scavengers disturbing the area. In fact, the whole cabin seemed eerily undisturbed, as though whoever had been inside had simply vanished into the ether. But the most chilling detail came when Mark looked at the door again. The planks were nailed securely from the inside, a fact that could not be ignored. Whoever had been in the cabin had done so deliberately, locking themselves in, or had they been locked in? The nails were bent in such a way that it was clear they had been hammered from the inside, suggesting that the person had been trapped, unable to escape. What could have caused such a desperate act? Was it fear of something outside? Or had the person been left to die in this makeshift prison, unable to escape? The entire scene felt surreal, as though the cabin itself had been frozen in time, a trap that had swallowed its occupant whole. As Mark climbed back down to where Dave was waiting, he could barely find the words to explain what he had just witnessed. His instincts told him this was something much darker than a simple forgotten shelter. Without hesitation, he instructed Dave to call the police. The authorities arrived soon after, and the area became a scene of intense investigation. The police and forensic experts climbed up into the cabin with the same trepidation that had gripped Mark. They documented every item, every detail, hoping to uncover a clue that could explain the strange death. In the backpack, they found identification that would finally answer the long-standing question of who had been trapped in the cabin. It was Patrick O'Hara, the missing hiker. The discovery of the tree cabin answered one question, but it raised many more. How had Patrick ended up there? Why had he been locked inside? The twisted reality of the situation sent shockwaves through everyone involved, as they realized that the answers they sought were far more complex than they had ever imagined. The mystery of Patrick's disappearance had just taken a dark and sinister turn. The discovery of Patrick O'Hara's remains inside the eerie tree cabin was only the beginning of a complex and chilling investigation that would unfold over the following months. As forensic experts began their examination of the body, they found themselves piecing together a tragic story that defied simple explanation. The skeletal remains, yellowed and brittle after nearly a decade in the elements, held key clues that would point to Patrick's cause of death, but the answers were far from straightforward. Initial analysis revealed that Patrick hadn't died from starvation, as many had initially suspected. His backpack, found beside his remains, contained an almost complete supply of freeze-dried food, a gas canister for his stove, and a set of untouched survival equipment. There was no sign of malnutrition or illness linked to prolonged hunger. Instead, the cause of death was traced to something far more insidious: hypothermia. Despite the fact that Patrick had been in a cabin, the conditions inside were far from comfortable. The uninsulated wooden structure, perched 12 feet above the ground, had allowed the damp, cold air of the forest to seep in. Even in the middle of summer, the temperatures in the region could drop close to freezing at night, especially with the constant rain and humidity that characterized the Tongass forest. This revelation deepened the mystery. How had someone so prepared, someone with so much knowledge of the wild, ended up trapped in a cold, damp cabin with no means of escape? The forensic team also discovered something even more unsettling: deep scratches on the walls of the cabin, visible beneath layers of grime and mildew. The marks were unmistakably made by human hands, perhaps even by fingernails. The scratches were clustered around the door, suggesting a desperate attempt to escape, but the nature of the marks raised more questions than they answered. Was Patrick trying to break out of the cabin in a frantic attempt to flee, or was he locked in by someone else? As investigators continued their work, the presence of the nails holding the door shut from the inside took on a new significance. The theory of an accidental death, while plausible at first, was quickly overshadowed by these new discoveries. The nails were bent in such a way that they could only have been hammered from the inside, suggesting that someone had deliberately locked themselves in or been locked in. The idea that Patrick had locked himself inside in a panic, driven by fear or some kind of external threat, began to take shape. The scratches on the walls seemed to confirm this. They were signs of desperation, of a man who had realized too late that he was trapped and who had tried to claw his way out of a situation that had spiraled out of his control. But was it really as simple as an accident gone wrong? As the evidence slowly came together, another theory began to emerge, one that was darker, more sinister. Patrick's actions, the condition of his campsite, and the state of the cabin all pointed towards a possible encounter with another human being or a group of people. A theory was floated that perhaps Patrick had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than a quiet walk in the wilderness. The forest, while isolated and wild, had always attracted individuals looking to escape the law, poachers in particular. Could Patrick have encountered a group of poachers? It seemed possible, if not likely. Several retired locals and old-time hunters who knew the area well suggested that poachers had used cabins like the one Patrick had found as hideouts, building them high above the ground to keep them out of the reach of bears and other predators. These hunters described a practice of using simple rope ladders that could be pulled up once inside, leaving no trace for anyone who might be looking. Was it possible that Patrick had discovered such a cabin and been caught by the poachers who used it? Had he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, and was that why he ended up trapped inside? This theory gained more traction when investigators examined the skull, which showed signs of blunt force trauma. A thin fracture line at the back of the head suggested that Patrick had been struck with a blunt object, possibly a rifle butt or another weapon. The blow could have caused concussion, disorientation, and perhaps even unconsciousness. It was then that the investigators began to build a timeline of events that painted a much darker picture. In this theory, Patrick, after leaving his camp, might have stumbled upon a group of poachers or illegal hunters operating deep within the forest. He could have inadvertently discovered something he wasn't supposed to, a poached deer, or worse, the poacher's hidden stash. The confrontation that followed would have been violent. Perhaps in an attempt to silence him, they struck him on the head, leaving him dazed and disoriented. After dragging him to the cabin, they might have trapped him inside, knowing that the cold, combined with his injuries, would eventually finish the job. Patrick, in a final act of survival, may have locked himself in, using the nails from the cabin's construction to secure the door as a desperate attempt to protect himself. But it was futile. The poachers would have left, knowing he would die from hypothermia or injury. The nails and the scratches, combined with the signs of violence, created a picture that was all too clear. Patrick had not died by accident. He had been trapped, left to die alone in the cold. The investigators were left with an unsettling conclusion. They had found a plausible theory, a deliberate act of murder disguised as an accident. But without any physical evidence to support the poacher theory, they were left with a chilling possibility. The true story of Patrick O'Hara's death was buried somewhere deep in the forest, known only to those who had left him there to die. The case would remain open, but with no suspects and no clear path to justice, it seemed as if the mystery would never be fully solved. As investigators delved deeper into the mystery of Patrick O'Hara's death, a new, darker theory began to take shape. For years, the idea of Patrick's disappearance had seemed like a tragic accident, a man getting lost in the remote wilderness, unable to find his way out in time. But as more evidence came to light, this theory began to crumble. With the discovery of his body in the tree cabin, forensic experts and law enforcement officials started to consider a far more sinister possibility that Patrick had encountered a group of poachers operating deep within the Tongass National Forest, and that they had been the ones to seal his fate. Poaching in the area was not an unfamiliar issue. The vast expanse of the Tongass National Forest, with its untouched beauty and dense, remote landscape, had long been a haven for illegal hunting, particularly for Sitka deer. Poachers, operating outside the law, would often enter the wilderness to hunt without permits, taking advantage of the forest's isolation to hide their activities. The idea that Patrick, an experienced hiker, could have crossed paths with a group of these poachers and that this encounter led to his tragic death was becoming more plausible by the day. The theory gained weight when investigators started to look at the location of the tree cabin. It was positioned high up in the trees, far from any well-established trails or hiking routes, suggesting it was not a typical shelter for hikers. Instead, it seemed like a hidden refuge, a secret place that poachers could use to avoid detection by rangers or other authorities. The fact that the cabin had no ladder and appeared to be virtually inaccessible except by a rope ladder that could be pulled up made it the perfect hideout. This, combined with the fact that no one had ever seen the cabin on any maps or records, suggested it had been deliberately kept hidden. In the case of Patrick O'Hara, the theory began to take shape. What if Patrick had stumbled upon this poacher's hideout during his hike? He was a seasoned traveler, familiar with the wilds of North America, and would likely have been careful in choosing his route. However, the vastness of the forest and its remoteness meant that even the most prepared adventurer could accidentally cross paths with someone they weren't supposed to meet. Patrick, possibly unaware of the illegal activities taking place in the forest, might have stumbled upon the poachers either by accident or while investigating some suspicious activity. The first confrontation likely happened when Patrick discovered the poachers, or their illicit catch. Perhaps he saw a poached deer carcass or some other evidence of illegal hunting. In such a situation, it's not hard to imagine the poachers becoming aware of his presence and reacting violently to protect themselves and their illicit business. Patrick, realizing the danger, could have tried to escape, but without his supplies, as evidenced by the fact that he left his neatly packed camp behind, he may have been unprepared for a confrontation. At this point, the theory suggests that a physical altercation occurred. The poachers, realizing they had a potential witness to their crime, may have decided to silence him. The forensic examination of Patrick's skull had revealed blunt force trauma, a fracture at the back of his head, suggesting he had been struck hard by a blunt object. This blow would have caused disorientation and perhaps even unconsciousness. It seemed likely that the poachers, in a panic, dragged him to the cabin, the only place in the vicinity where they could hide him. But it wasn't just the injury that raised questions, it was the state of the cabin itself. The door had been nailed shut from the inside, something that initially seemed like an act of self-preservation by Patrick. But as investigators considered the evidence more closely, it became apparent that Patrick might not have locked himself in. The theory now suggested that, in a desperate bid to escape, he had been forced into the cabin by the poachers. Perhaps in his panic he had tried to lock the door, thinking that by barricading himself inside he might be able to protect himself from whatever threats lurked outside. However, this theory also raised more questions. If Patrick had been conscious and aware enough to lock the door, why had he not taken any other steps to escape? The answer lay in his injuries. The blow to his head would have likely left him disoriented, perhaps unable to think clearly. The poachers, knowing their victim was helpless and trapped, may have simply left him there, knowing that the cold would finish what they had started. The temperatures in the forest, even in the summer, could plummet to near freezing at night, and without a sleeping bag or proper insulation, Patrick had no chance of surviving the exposure. In the days following this new theory, the investigators focused on the possible link between poaching and Patrick's death. They reviewed old police reports, interviewing retired foresters, hunters, and locals who had worked in the area for years. Many of them recalled rumors of poachers operating in the region, hiding out in makeshift cabins, just like the one where Patrick's body had been discovered. It seemed that the area had once been a hotspot for illegal hunting, and the idea that poachers could have been responsible for Patrick's death began to take a more chilling shape. Yet, despite the compelling evidence, the case remained frustratingly open-ended. There was no hard evidence linking any specific individuals to the crime. The poachers, if they had been involved, had covered their tracks well. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, and no DNA evidence to point directly to anyone. The cabin had been dismantled. The body had been examined, but the culprits remained faceless. The true story of what had happened to Patrick O'Hara in '80. Those final harrowing days remained lost, with only theories to fill in the gaps. In the end, the story of Patrick's death became not only a tale of misfortune, but a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that lurk in even the most pristine wildernesses. While the poacher theory seemed to fit the evidence, it was also a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous encounters are those that occur when we least expect them, and with people we would never have imagined. As the investigation into Patrick O'Hara's death draws to a close, we are left with more questions than answers. Despite years of probing, the case remains unsolved, and the truth of what happened to Patrick that fateful summer day in 2013 is shrouded in mystery. The theories surrounding his death, from accidental hypothermia to a more sinister encounter with poachers, all offer plausible explanations, yet none can be definitively proven. Without hard evidence or a clear suspect, the mystery lingers in the cold, dark corners of the Tongass National Forest, where the only certainty is the silence of the trees. Patrick's family, though finally able to lay his remains to rest, will never know for sure what truly happened to their loved one. The unanswered questions about who was responsible for locking him away in that tree cabin, and why, will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The truth, it seems, is lost to the wilderness, a secret the forest keeps locked away, just like the cabin where Patrick met his tragic end. The story of Patrick O'Hara is a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most remote corners of the world. As we reflect on his tale, we are left to wonder, how many more secrets lie hidden in the depths of the wild, waiting to be uncovered? If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life mysteries, true crime investigations, and unsolved cases. Join us as we continue to unravel the stories that hide in plain sight, because sometimes the truth is darker than we could ever imagine.